I remember sitting there, shaking the letter in my hands, laughing nervously and thinking, well, isn't that something? I didn't jump for joy. No. I sat there quietly, letting the weight of the news settle. And then, for the first time in months, I smiled. Not because of the money itself, but because, well, let's just say life was about to get interesting. I didn't know it then, but this letter would be the spark that lit the fire. The same children who had ignored me, abandoned me, left me to wrestle with my sickness alone. They were about to see me in a very different light. And so here I am telling you this story. Not as a warning, not entirely as revenge, but as a truth. Families are complicated. Love can be conditional. And sometimes the world will test you in ways you never imagined. I didn't tell anyone about the letter at first. Not David, not Ruth, not James. I tucked it away in my drawer, alongside old photographs and bills I'd been meaning to pay. It wasn't about secrecy or malice. No, it was about savoring a moment of quiet triumph for myself, a small victory in a life that had often felt like a series of disappointments. For weeks, I went about my routine, still tending the garden, still walking the dog, still drinking my bitter tea on cold mornings. But I started noticing a subtle shift in the neighborhood. A neighbor would stop by and casually remark, "Heard about that investment from your old friend, Joe. That's quite something." Others would nod knowingly when I passed, as if the news had traveled before I even said a word. And then, as if on cue, the phone calls began. The first was David. "Dad, hi. I was just, thinking about you." I knew immediately that something had changed. The tone of his voice, hesitant, almost nervous, was unlike the clipped, impatient voice I'd grown accustomed to. "Yes, David," I asked calmly, pretending to sip my tea. "Well, you know, about your situation. I was wondering if maybe we could talk. Maybe I could come by." I set my cup down carefully, savoring the moment. "Of course, David. You can come by tomorrow." The very next day he showed up, dressed sharply as always, like he had stepped out of a business magazine. Smiling, shaking my hand a little too enthusiastically, glancing around the living room as if noticing all the little things he'd ignored for years. "How have you been, Dad?" he asked, with just the right amount of concern to sound believable. I leaned back in my chair, pretending to cough, rubbing my chest like the old man I was supposed to be. "Getting by," I said lightly. "You know how it is. Old bones, old habits." David nodded, and we chatted for a while. I let him talk, let him fill the silence with words that had always been absent. I could see the underlying motive in his eyes, though. Money. Always money. But I didn't interrupt. I didn't call him out. I just let him talk. Ruth was next. I got a text, simple and short. "Hi, Dad, can I come see you? I've been thinking a lot about things lately." When she arrived, she brought with her a bouquet of flowers, a guilty smile, and an energy that seemed almost too bright, too eager. She hugged me, lingered just long enough, and then started asking about the house, the garden, the old furniture. "You've really kept things nice," she said, and I nodded politely. "Yes, well, you know me. Always liked keeping things tidy." Her eyes flicked toward the drawer where I had hidden the letter. Oh, she didn't know it yet, but her instincts were starting to sense a change. She was curious. They both were. I spent the next few days quietly observing, listening. David called 3 times in one morning. Ruth sent messages that needed urgent replies. James stopped by, seemingly concerned but also unsure how to approach the topic. They were circling, like vultures smelling something worthwhile. And then came the day when I decided it was time to reveal a piece of the truth. I didn't rush. I didn't make it dramatic. I simply placed the letter on the kitchen table and said casually, "You might want to read this." David was the first to notice. He picked it up with shaking hands, eyes scanning quickly, lips moving silently as he read. I sat back, arms crossed, pretending to sip my tea again. Ruth leaned over his shoulder, gasping softly. James stood behind them, scratching his head, a mix of confusion and awe spreading across his face. "Millions. This is really yours?" David stammered. "Yes," I said with a small, almost imperceptible smile. "All of it." What happened next was both predictable and deliciously ironic. David's posture changed immediately. The casual confidence melted into a sort of frantic attentiveness. "Dad, we could, maybe talk about managing this, investing, building things." He babbled, words spilling faster than I could keep up with. Ruth, ever dramatic, clutched her pearls and said, "Oh, Dad, why didn't you tell us sooner? We could have helped you, taken care of things together." And James, the poor dear, looked like a man who had just walked into a hornet's nest in his pajamas. "Wow, that's, really something, Dad. Amazing. Really." I didn't interrupt. I let them flail. Let them try to charm me, reason with me, bribe me. Whatever they thought they could do to get a piece of this windfall. I sipped my tea slowly. Enjoyed the moment. Savored it. Because here was the truth, plain and simple. They had abandoned me when I was sick, when I needed them, when I had nothing but my cough and my pride. And now, when life had changed in my favor, suddenly they wanted in. It would be easy to imagine a scenario where anger takes over, where I stormed them out, slammed doors, yelled, made a spectacle. But that's not Uncle Joe. I don't need to shout to be heard. Silence, patience, and letting people reveal themselves, that's far more satisfying. And reveal themselves they did. David tried flattery. Ruth tried guilt. James was honest. He admitted he felt guilty for not being there more. Not that it mattered much in that moment. I laughed quietly, and Ruth looked at me, startled. "You're laughing?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I'm laughing because this is exactly how life teaches lessons. You can't buy experience, and you can't fake loyalty. You either have it or you don't." They all glanced at each other, uncertainty creeping in. This wasn't the warm welcome they had imagined. This wasn't an old man begging for attention or approval. This was me, fully aware, fully in control, and watching them squirm. Over the next few weeks I started to test them. Not maliciously. Not cruelly. Just strategically. I let David invite me to a lunch, where he spent most of the time talking about his business and hinting at investments. Ruth came by with baked goods and endless chatter about how much she cared. James tried to mediate, suggesting family trips and outings. I listened, nodded, occasionally smiled, and reminded myself of one key principle. I could never make them love me again, not truly. but I could make them realize the weight of their choices and maybe, just maybe, learn a lesson about what really matters in life. Because you see, it isn't the money. Never was. It's the loyalty, the respect, the willingness to be there when it counts. And they had all failed that test when I was lying alone, sick and ignored. Even amidst the tension, there were moments that made me chuckle. I suppose you could say I'm not the kind of man who usually tells his business to strangers. All my life I've been the one listening, not the one talking. You know, the type old men who sit on the porch, rocking in a chair, nodding at the world as if they've got all its secrets hidden in their shirt pocket. That's me, or at least that's how I used to be. Quiet. Reserved. I never liked fussing about things. But life has a way of pressing stories into your bones until you can't keep them inside anymore. Mine has been pressed so deep into me that even if I tried to keep silent, it would leak out through my eyes, my voice, the very wrinkles in my face. So today, I'll tell you what happened. I'll tell you about the time I was left for dead by my own children, and how fate, call it God, call it chance, call it old-fashioned karma, decided to turn the table on them. You see, the story doesn't end with them walking away. No. It ends with them crawling back. Crawling back when I least expected it, when I had something they never imagined I'd have, more money than all of them combined. Millions, if you want me to put a number to it. And if you think money solves problems, well, you'll soon see how wrong that is. Sometimes money only brings out the ugliest parts of people. But before we get to the end, before the phone calls started, before the sudden visits with forced smiles and awkward hugs, let's go back. Because to understand why their crawling back was so bitterly sweet, you have to know what came before. I wasn't always an old man with thinning hair and a stiff knee. Once upon a time, I was young and foolish, just like everybody else. I married the love of my life, Margaret, when I was 24. She had the kind of smile that could soften a stone, and she made the best sweet potato pie in 3 counties. If you don't believe me, ask anyone who ever came by our house on Thanksgiving. Margaret gave me 3 children. David, the eldest, born with a stubborn streak just like mine. Ruth, my only daughter, who had her mother's sweetness but also her sharp tongue when she wanted it. And finally, James, the youngest, who always seemed to be caught between wanting to please me and wanting to do his own thing. 3 children. 3 blessings, I thought. Now, if you had asked me 30 years ago, I'd have said I was a lucky man. I worked hard, provided for my family, tried to teach my kids right from wrong. I wasn't perfect. Far from it. But I thought I'd done my duty. You know, raised them in a house that didn't leak, put food on the table, tucked them in at night. That's what fathers are supposed to do, right? But children, they grow up. They change. They make choices you don't always agree with. And sometimes they surprise you in ways you could never imagine. I first started noticing the cracks after Margaret died. That was the blow that knocked the wind out of me. She passed away quietly in her sleep one morning, and just like that, the house felt empty. A house without a wife is just a collection of walls, let me tell you. The laughter goes out of it. The warmth. It's like the sun sets and doesn't rise again. My children cried at her funeral, of course. They stood by me at least for that day. But even then, I could feel something shifting. David was restless, tapping his foot the whole time, as if he had somewhere more important to be. Ruth hugged me, but she looked distracted, already glancing at her phone, already half gone in her mind. And James. Well, James tried, bless him. He stayed with me the longest, sat in the kitchen that evening, drank tea with me. But he too had to leave eventually. They all did. I tried not to blame them. Life moves fast when you're young, doesn't it? Jobs, spouses, children of their own. I told myself, Joe, don't be selfish. They have lives to live. And I believed that for a while. But then the sickness came. It started as a cough. Nothing too serious at first. I'd clear my throat and keep going. I was still mowing my own lawn, still fixing the squeaky gate out front. But then the cough grew heavier. My chest burned at night. Climbing the stairs felt like running a marathon. Eventually, the doctor looked me in the eye and said words no old man wants to hear. Your body is failing you, Joe. You need care. You can't do this alone. Care. That word echoed in my head. Not the kind of care you give to a child when he scrapes his knee. Not the kind of care Margaret used to give me when she'd rub ointment on my back after a long day. No, this was the kind of care where you depend on others, where you admit you're no longer strong enough to stand on your own 2 feet. So I turned to my children. After all, what else was I supposed to do? David was well off, working in finance, living in a house that looked like something out of a magazine. Ruth had a family of her own, a nice house in the suburbs, plenty of room. And James? Well, James was still finding his footing, but he was kind-hearted. I thought surely one of them would open their door to me. That was the hope anyway. But hope has a cruel way of disappointing a man. Before I tell you how they abandoned me, let me pause here. Because I don't want you to think I'm painting myself as some kind of saint, and them as villains. I wasn't perfect. I was strict, sometimes too strict. I made decisions they didn't always like. I didn't pay for David's fancy college. I told Ruth she was too young to marry that man who later broke her heart. I scolded James more times than I can count. I wasn't the easygoing, pat-you-on-the-back kind of dad. I was tough. Maybe too tough. But I loved them. And in my old age, I thought that counted for something. Turns out, love doesn't always pay the bills, nor does it always earn you loyalty when your hair turns gray. Because when I knocked on their doors, sometimes literally, they turned me away. Not all at once. Not dramatically. No, it was quieter than that, more subtle. That's the thing about abandonment. Sometimes it doesn't come with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes with excuses, with polite words that cut sharper than knives. But I'll tell you about that soon. But for now, let me leave you with the image of an old man, coughing into his handkerchief, staring at the phone that never rings, wondering if raising children had been worth it after all. Because before they came crawling back, before the millions entered the picture, I was alone. And loneliness, my friend, can weigh more than any sickness. The first time I realized things were going to get complicated, I was lying in my old recliner, a cup of lukewarm tea resting on the arm, and staring out the window at the maple tree in the front yard. It had lost some of its leaves already, a little early for fall, or maybe I was just noticing things differently now that life had slowed down. My body ached in places I didn't even know could ache, and my chest felt heavy like a sack of bricks someone had just dumped there. I picked up the phone and dialed David, my oldest son. I'd never been the type to call much, always leaving it to them when they wanted something. But now, with a rasp in my voice, I needed to hear someone tell me it would be okay. Hello. His voice was clipped, professional, like I had interrupted a meeting. "David, it's me. I'm not feeling too well." "Oh, Dad. Yeah, that's too bad. Busy right now though, can't really talk long. Maybe later." I swallowed hard, coughing into the sleeve of my shirt. "Maybe later." I muttered. Later. That word. It tastes bitter when you're the one who needs help. I didn't call again that day. I tried Ruth. Tried James. Same story. Busy. Can't talk. Maybe later. Days turned into weeks. My cough got worse, my chest tighter. I had to climb the stairs slowly, stopping halfway, gripping the railing like a man holding on to the last thread of pride he has left. I tried to act normal when neighbors stopped by. I smiled. I laughed. I joked about the way my knees sounded like a bucket of gravel rolling down the driveway. "Guess I'm just seasoning naturally," I'd say, and they'd chuckle. They didn't know that when I closed the door behind me, I sometimes fell onto the couch and didn't get up for hours. It was during one of those long afternoons, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, that I realized I had to ask my children to take me in. Not for days. Not for a visit. But long term. I needed care. I needed them. David was the first I called again, hoping this time he'd understand. "Dad, I really can't. Work's insane. Ruth's got a baby, I've got. I don't know. Dad, can you manage for a bit longer?" Manage? I laughed weakly. "David, I can't even manage to get out of this chair without coughing my lungs out." "I know, Dad. I know." His voice softened slightly. "I'll see what I can do, but it's complicated." Complicated. That word, too, would become my companion for the next few months. Complicated, busy later. Ruth was worse. She pretended to be sympathetic at first, sending cards, calling occasionally. But every time I asked her to come over to help, she'd find some excuse. "I've got the baby's recital. The house is a mess. Can't take time off work." She even offered to pay a nurse to visit. I didn't want a nurse. I wanted my daughter. Wanted the person I'd kissed goodnight when she was 5. Wanted the person I'd wiped tears from when she scraped her knee. I wanted her presence. James. God bless James. He was the only one who came regularly. For a while. He'd visit, sit with me, bring food. But even James had limits. He had a job he couldn't take off from, friends, a girlfriend who didn't like him spending all his weekends with his sick old father. By the time the holidays rolled around, even James started showing up less. I didn't blame him. Life moves on, doesn't it? But the silence from David and Ruth, that's the sound that lingers. I suppose you could say I started noticing patterns, little things that hinted at their true feelings. David would text me the day after a holiday. "Hope you had a good Thanksgiving, Dad." As if I had nothing better to do than sit alone and hope. Ruth would comment on my Facebook posts, liking pictures of my garden, my dog, my meals, but never calling, never visiting. And James sent me funny memes about old people and hip replacements. I laughed, but inside there was a growing ache. Then came the day when I really realized they'd abandoned me. It was a cold, gray morning. I had a fever, my chest burning. I tried to get out of bed to take my morning tea, and the pain hit me like a hammer. I couldn't move. Couldn't even pick up the cup. I called David. No answer. Ruth. Voicemail. James. Busy. I sat there, shaking, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the life I had given them. Every sacrifice, every hard night, every penny I worked for. And here I was, lying alone, coughing, wishing for even a single hand to hold mine. And that's when it hit me. They didn't want me. They wanted me only when it was convenient, or when there was something in it for them. I'd spent a lifetime believing that love between a parent and child was unconditional. How foolish that seemed now. But even in the darkest times, there were small flickers of light. My neighbor, Mrs. Lopez, came over with soup. Her smile was bright, full of warmth, and she didn't mind my coughing. We'd sit for hours talking about life, sharing stories. I realized that sometimes strangers give more care than family. Funny how life works that way. I also found solace in small routines. Reading old letters from Margaret, watering the plants in the garden, walking the dog down the lane. These things became my lifeline. They were tiny reminders that the world still had good in it, even if my children had turned away. Yet, every time the phone didn't ring, every time a door didn't open, the bitterness grew. I started keeping a list in my head, every excuse, every delay, every polite refusal. And I promised myself if life ever gave me another chance, I would remember each one. Because life has a funny way of balancing the scales. And it doesn't always take long. Sometimes all it needs is the right moment. Months passed. The sickness lingered, but so did my stubbornness. I refused to let the world see me as weak. I cooked my own meals when I could, mowed what grass I was able, tended to the garden. But inside, I felt the emptiness more each day. The silence of my home, the absence of their voices. It was deafening. And then came the turning point, though I didn't know it yet. The day I received a letter in the mail. Ordinary, beige envelope, nothing fancy. But when I opened it, the words inside would change everything. It was from an old friend, one I hadn't spoken to in decades. A friend who had, years ago, invested in a small business venture with me. They called it a retirement fund at the time. I'd almost forgotten about it. But apparently, over the years, that investment had grown. Not a little. Not moderately. It had grown to a sum I never dared to imagine. Millions. Like the day David tried to subtly measure the size of my study, pretending to admire the books, probably imagining how he could rearrange everything once the money was in his hands. Or Ruth asking me repeatedly if I needed help with my household chores, looking at me like I was a fragile old statue that needed constant dusting. And James simply stood back, trying not to pick sides, looking like a deer caught in the headlights of family drama. I allowed those little moments. They were funny in a bitter sort of way, a reminder that life doesn't stop being ironic just because you're older. The days after the inheritance reveal were interesting, to say the least. David called constantly, each time more animated than the last. Ruth showed up unannounced, bringing casseroles, pies, and an overly bright smile that seemed almost to demand forgiveness. James continued to tread carefully, stepping into conversations like a man trying not to set off a hidden landmine. I watched them closely, not out of malice, but out of curiosity. After all those months of neglect, the sudden change in their attention was fascinating. Humans are creatures of habit, but when faced with opportunity, even the most hardened habits can shift overnight. I was witnessing that shift firsthand. The first real confrontation came over lunch, orchestrated quietly by David. He wanted to discuss the inheritance, as if it were a business transaction rather than a family issue. I poured coffee for all of us, sat down at the old kitchen table, and let him speak first. "Dad," he began, voice careful. We need to make sure this is handled properly. You know, your estate, the money. It's a lot, and well, you deserve the best advice." I smiled faintly, setting down my cup. "Advice, huh? You mean like the advice I asked for when I was sick and you were too busy?" David blinked, caught off guard. I didn't. I cut him off gently but firmly. "Don't worry about excuses, David. We're past those. Let's focus on now. I have what I have. You have what you choose to do with it. That's the beauty of life." Ruth, never one to sit quietly, leaned forward. "Dad, I just want us to be a family again. I've made mistakes. I know I did." I chuckled softly, shaking my head. "Ruth, you know I love you. But love doesn't erase choices. It doesn't erase the months when I called and no one answered. I'm not angry. Just observant." Her smile faltered. "That's the thing about honesty. It can be sharper than the finest knife." James, bless his heart, tried to mediate. "Maybe we could, make things right. Help Dad with the house. Take him on trips." I leaned back, arms crossed, and studied him. "James, you're the only one who stayed near me who actually cared enough to check in. Don't worry about trying to fix things that can't be fixed. Just stay yourself." That was the first lesson I handed out. Loyalty isn't something you get with money. It's something you give when it costs nothing but love. James understood that. The others, well, they were still calculating. Over the next few weeks, I continued to navigate the visits, slowly deciding how involved each child would be in my life going forward. I offered opportunities to make amends, but on my terms. David, he could come by, yes. But the second he tried to manipulate the conversation toward business investments or how I should handle my money, I reminded him gently, "David, the money isn't yours yet." Ruth. I invited her to garden with me. She loved that. It was therapeutic. She laughed, she shared stories, and I let her feel needed. But I made sure she understood that my trust wasn't given lightly. James. He stayed close like a son should. We played cards, walked the dog, and talked for hours about nothing and everything. I realized then that love between a parent and child doesn't always need dramatic gestures. Sometimes it's just showing up, day after day, in quiet ways. The real climax came one evening, over dinner. I had prepared a simple meal: chicken, mashed potatoes, a little gravy, nothing fancy. David and Ruth both appeared, expecting something grand, something to impress. Instead, they got the same old Joe, calm, smiling, and fully in control. "Dad, we want to talk about your will," David began. I put down my fork. "No, David. Tonight we talk about us. About what matters. Money can wait." Ruth's eyes widened. What do you mean?" I smiled. "I mean, I have watched both of you scramble, manipulate, and calculate over something that isn't even yours. And I realized something. I am not giving you a single cent until I know you truly understand what it means to care." David sputtered. Ruth looked scandalized. James smiled. I continued, "You see, I may be old, I may be weak, I may cough like a man who's been hit by life one too many times, but I am still in charge." "And I will decide who deserves what. Loyalty, respect, love. Those are things money cannot buy. If you want my wealth, you must first prove that you care when it costs nothing." They both sat there stunned. I took a bite of chicken, chewed thoughtfully, and added with a small smirk, "And for the record, I cook better than any restaurant you'll find downtown. So at least appreciate that part of my fortune." James laughed. Ruth rolled her eyes. David just sighed, defeated. Over the next months, things slowly changed. David learned humility. He helped with chores, mowed the lawn, and even learned to cook a decent breakfast. Ruth stayed longer on her visits, sharing time, not just food. N.D. James. James remained the faithful son I always hoped he'd be. I didn't give them the money immediately. Oh no, they had to earn my trust, my presence, and my respect. And in the process, they learned lessons about patience, about care, about seeing beyond their own desires. By the time I finally updated my will, I did so with clarity. James received a fair share, deservedly. David and Ruth. They got portions too, but they understood that the real inheritance was not the money. It was the lesson they had learned about loyalty, love, and the fleeting nature of opportunity. I look back now and I smile. Not bitterly, not cruelly, but with the understanding that life has a sense of humor. It teaches, it punishes, it rewards, and sometimes it waits patiently until you are ready to pay attention. I think of the nights I lay alone, coughing, waiting for someone to care, wondering if my children would remember me. And now, I watch them, and I see that memory has finally reached them. Slowly, awkwardly, they are learning what I already knew. I also learned something important myself, that even when abandoned, when ignored, when life seems bleak, there is always the possibility of renewal. Sometimes it comes in the form of an inheritance. Sometimes it comes in the form of a smile from a neighbor. Sometimes it comes in the quiet loyalty of a son who never left your side. And yes, sometimes it comes with a little humor. Because if you can't laugh at life, even at its cruelty, even at its irony, then what's the point? So, my friends, that is the story. They abandoned me when I was sick, yes. But when the millions came, they all came running back. Some with greed in their eyes, some with guilt in their hearts. And me. I welcomed them, but on my terms. With lessons learned. With boundaries. With wisdom that comes only from age and experience. In the end, it wasn't the money that mattered. It was seeing who truly cared, who would stay when nothing was promised, who would sit quietly beside me in my hardest times. And those were the children I cherished most. And as for the rest, well, they got the lesson of a lifetime. And perhaps in time that lesson will mean more than all the millions in the world. Don't go yet. Please like this video and subscribe to this channel.